Welcome, everyone. As you take a minute to load in here, we just want to let you know you're in the right place with Operation Parent and Dr. Aaron Weiner today. We're super excited that you've chosen to be with us this afternoon to gather and learn together. If you could take a minute and go to operationparent.org, we wanted to let you know about our next session on March the 1st. The subject is gaming and is with Dr. Clifford Sussman. So while we're loading everyone into the presentation, we would love it if you could go over to operationparent.org and think about registering for the next webinar while you've got a minute and you're thinking about it. Operation Parent's mission is to love and support parents by providing real-world information, connection, and most importantly, the most important thing is hope. Welcome today to Sex, Drugs, and Netflix. We're hoping to give you parenting strategies about how to talk to your teens regarding drug use and sex in popular media. We're here with Dr. Aaron Weiner, and we are so excited to get going today. We wanted to just I wanted to also go through the technical components, Dr. Weiner, before we do your introduction, or we can do your intro first if you'd like. Why don't we just do that? So we are delighted to have Dr. Weiner back with us today, and he's done multiple presentations for us on mental health, as well as he's a trailblazer in marijuana, and he is really advocating for parents to be more educated about what's happening there, the trends, what's going on with legislation, um, and just he specializes in addiction as well. He's a clinical psychologist out of Chicago, and he's blessed us by being with us on multiple presentations. So we do want to first and foremost encourage you to go back to our webinar library once you connect with Dr. Weiner today, and also watch a couple of his past webinars. I'd also encourage you to partner up with him on LinkedIn. That's a great place to see what he is putting out into the universe and his specialty areas. But before we go any further, Dr. Weiner, if you'll give me just a second to go through the technical components so people know how to participate today. You've got an orange grab tab on the top of your screen. If you'll click on that orange arrow, you can open up your control panel and check it out fully with me. We're going to utilize the question feature today. That's about halfway down your control panel, and you're going to send your questions privately to us. We welcome those anytime during the presentation. We are going to address those all at the very end, but they can keep coming. They can start coming in now and go all the way through the hour-long presentation today. We have amazing handouts that we've put together for you today. They are all from Truth Initiative, and they are titled As Streaming Soars, These Binge Watching Shows Frequently Depict Tobacco Use. And we're going to get in there and talk to you today about how frequently they are showing tobacco use. We're also going to show you the trends on the binging streaming trends, which we all know are heavy, but you'll be, I think, surprised by how heavy they actually are and how that unfolds to the tobacco imagery that our teens are seeing. And then also, while you were streaming nicotine, the full on-demand report from Truth Initiative. We think this is going to be helpful for the general parents that are with us today, as well as those of you that are from drug-free coalitions across the country. If you'll tag down in that report, it's a lengthy one, but if you'll go down to page 13, you're going to see some action items that you could do in your community if you are also concerned about the prevalence of nicotine imagery in shows that our teens are watching. So we're also going to learn a little bit more about the shows that our teens are watching today. If you don't have a lot of time to dig in there and watch those shows, we're going to encourage you to take a look at a couple of those and just be in there in the trenches with your teens and know what they're watching. You can double click on those handouts right here with us. You also received an email from us right before the presentation, so don't worry if you don't get them here. You probably already have them in your inbox. We are recording this presentation, and it's going to be sent in a follow-up email tomorrow, about 24 hours after this presentation. We're also providing a certificate of attendance for those that joined us live. So I think that, oh, last thing, sorry, the survey. We will be sending you a survey directly after Dr. Weiner's presentation. We promise you it will only take you about 2 minutes to complete that survey. Dr. Weiner can back me up on this. We always use information from that survey to continue to improve our program, and we will always do that. So your time will be well utilized if you go in there and take that 2-minute survey at the end. So now it is my distinct pleasure to turn this webinar over to Dr. Aaron Weiner, and thank you for everything that you've put together for us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you everybody. I know Michelle already said it, but thanks everybody for coming today. It's I always love being an active member of the Operation Parent family, and hopefully you guys do as well. I've been a fan of the organization for years now, and as Michelle has mentioned, I've done quite a few webinars. Because I believe so strongly in knowledge and what knowledge can do in the hands of people who could really use it. And parents, more than anyone else, really need knowledge about what's going on with psychological and then also sociological dynamics of teens, because there's so much that's changing and it's so very much a moving topic. The one credential that's not on this page that I do want to throw out there, because it's a great group, I'd encourage you to look into it if today's presentation interests you, is the Society of Addiction Psychology. I'm actually the president-elect of that group, and they do all the psychological research essentially in the side of addiction is through that hub, and it's a tremendous group, a great resource when you're talking about really evidence-based, research-based information on topics where there's so much confusion. So my hope for you guys today, in terms of what we're here to talk about and then discuss, I will mention, as Michelle said, we have an extended period at the end for some Q&A, which, as I told her during our tech check yesterday, makes me slightly nervous. There might be some, it's never fun to say, I don't know, although I'm not scared to do it, but there's a lot of time to chat. So please feel free to put your questions in there if you have some that we don't cover today. But our goals for today is to have you leave understanding how business is used media to impact teen behavior, to understand the connection, and this is really the critical part, between what young people see on screen and then what they do in real life. And we're going to spend a bit of time talking about how that works and where the weak points are, where you can intervene between this link between what they see and what they do. And then we're also going to talk about strategies for how you can communicate with your teen, both generally around difficult subjects like the media they're consuming and what they like to look at, as well as specifically about these mature themes that we're going to talk about in our presentation today. So hopefully you'll leave today not just with knowledge, but with things that you can actually put to use, because I think that's the best part of learning is when it's actionable. So with that being said, let's dive in. And I want to start with just setting the frame that a lot of times when we look at the balance between real life and media, we think about that real life informs media, that people sing about what they're experiencing or about their histories, or that's what they're, what they're making shows about, movies about. But it also can go in the other direction, where when someone comes up with an idea or a theme or a cultural change, there's no bigger megaphone than media, because millions and millions and millions and millions of people watch it. So it can echo across the collective psyche in a way that things really haven't in the past. It's a particular change in the way that ideas are disseminated now than in the past. And so ultimately what you're looking at right now is an interplay between both of these, where real life can affect media, media can affect real life, and then sometimes you get into these feedback loops where you can have certain societal trends that are very much enhanced through this interplay where they bounce off of each other. And the technical term in the research world that we have for how media impacts behavior in real life is called media pressure. So media pressure happens when we see people that we identify with or that we admire. There's a part of us that wants to emulate them, and it might be unconscious, it might be conscious, but we're drawn to things that we like. There's the term for this also that you use sometimes is called lifestyle marketing. When you think about brands, like the clothes that you buy or the types of foods, the vendors that you buy from, a lot of times their marketing is designed to appeal to someone just like you, or someone who wants a lifestyle or is living a lifestyle that's very similar to yours, and then they just insert their product into it. And that's part of how they kind of bundle that in with what it means to be your age or your identity or whatever it is. And so this is especially true, though, for someone forming their identity, which is why this intersection with kids and particularly with teens is so critical, because this is the age where young people are figuring out who they want to be and what they like and what's cool. And some of the choices that they make at this age have these reverberations that can last for the rest of their life in terms of the people that they meet and the societies that they join or the communities that they're a part of, the peer groups, that sort of thing. It makes a big difference. This can, I know today, the title of the presentation implies that we're going to talk about this in the more cautionary light, what parents have to watch out for, and that's true, but it actually cuts in both directions, where it can be positive or negative. No matter what your politics are, the fact that Kamala Harris is the vice president is inspiring young girls to think that they can achieve this station in the government, and when maybe they couldn't prior, much less African-American women. There's the role model aspect of it, seeing something in the media and wanting to emulate it can inspire you, or it can push you in a negative direction. And we see this in a lot of different mediums, right? TV, movies, music, video games, social media, YouTube. There's a reason why Captain Planet existed, right? And it wasn't because people didn't care about recycling, right? Or the other themes that people were pressing on with this. When you echo it out over the media, people tend to emulate it. And it can either be something that's direct or indirect. So what direct media pressure means, it's another way of saying essentially product placement. And there's a million examples of this, but just to give you a couple that are very iconic, right? If Tom Cruise essentially saved Ray-Bans. I mean, Wayfarers, Aviators, they were not doing well. And then with a couple of well-placed products in movies, they started fashion trends that completely turned them around. And when you think about, everyone knows what type of car James Bond drives, right? Aston Martins. It's baked into it. And then you have the more one-offs, right? But none of this is by accident. Your Duracells and Dr. Peppers, Ross holding a Sprite, Sennheiser. It's all on purpose, because it enters the fabric of your mind, and also creates we'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, this priming effect, where when you think about batteries, you think about Duracell, for example, and when that's seen again millions and millions of times, it makes a difference. That's also why when we go back to the world of youth behavior, why we see all the social media influencing going on around vaping. Because again, if you think about lifestyle, when you look at these social media influencers and how here they are promoting these vape devices, the reason why influencers are called influencers is because they exert media pressure. You put something in their hand, and young people then are more likely to do it. Now, it can be direct like this, where it's literally paid for, or it can be indirect. And there's actually a couple examples of this where it's not intentional in shows we're going to talk about today in a second. But fashion's a big one. When you think about Bonnie and Clyde, Annie Hall, and the impact they had on the fashion industry at the time, it was huge. And even common vernacular, things like Grey's Anatomy actually created seriously as a thing that you say like as a single word sentence or as a response that really wasn't done before it was repeated over and over and over again on that show. Likewise, in these more modern examples, when The Queen's Gambit came out, which is the most watched Netflix miniseries, I think to date, I don't think it's been topped, where with chess at the core of it, chess products started selling all over the place. It, as it says in this byline, reignited interest in the game, and digital subscription sets started selling because people were watching it and seeing it in a new light. Eggo waffles are also one of the obsessions of one of the characters on Stranger Things, another show we'll be touching on today, from the more drug-related side. But they also, every time a new season of Stranger Things comes out, Eggo waffles get a boost, and they actually didn't pay for this. This was just something that was written into the script. But this is indirect media pressure, where something's out there, people are watching, and then they think, well, I could do that too, or that looks like fun, or if they like this product, maybe I will as well. But, and this is really the reason why we're having this presentation today, indirect media pressure isn't always benign. You may have seen this when it happened a couple of years back, but 13 Reasons Why is a show about essentially teen suicide. And after it came out, there were some studies that they went in both ways, but essentially that were saying because of what was explicitly discussed and demonstrated on this show, it led to an increase in youth suicides. And there was a couple studies that said yes, a couple that said no. Bottom line though, that's a debate that you don't ever want to have. Like, you never want your art product or anything to be potentially spurring suicide. You know, that's never the intent, which is actually part of why they added a disclaimer that you can now see at the beginning of the season, a new intro, basically saying you might not want to watch the show if you're depressed. You might not want to watch the show if you're contemplating suicide, because, you know, of course, that's not what the actors and directors were intending, but it seems like that might have been a result. So how does this work with substance use? Well, the downside right now, when this comes to substances, is that they are everywhere right now on streaming services. So looking at it historically, and the Truth Initiative, as Michelle mentioned, they have done an amazing job of tracking this over time. I can't remember if their first report on this came out in 2017 or 2018, but they've been releasing one per year. And the one that you've got in that handout section is their new update on just published here in 2022 on 2021 data. And I've got a screenshot from it actually on the next slide. But what they've been finding is that there's a tremendous amount of tobacco imagery in particular in very popular shows, including the top shows for kids. And that's what we're looking at in these slides. So on the right here, you can see the total incidences of tobacco in 2018 shows and how many times they were seen. And then in 2019 shows, you can see it there as well. And in 2019, Stranger Things, smoking was absolutely everywhere. Netflix actually caught a lot of flack from this, for this in particular. But what they found was that seven of the shows, as it says down there at the bottom, were rated TVG or PG, and tobacco depictions in those shows, so the ones that are made for kids, basically more than doubled. Now, it's worth mentioning that a big part of that had to do with Stranger Things. Stranger Things is a, you know, is a show that has, as you can see, way more than just about anything else. But part of the issue with this as well is that the percentage of episodes of these shows, the kids are seeing them over and over and over again. So in these top shows that kids watch, smoking is there over and over and over again. And so it's not just that they're getting the message once, it's that it's getting normalized. It's being very much habituated as this is something that I'm going to watch on a weekly basis, or this is something that I'm going to watch even in one day over and over and over again if they are binge watching. And that's actually, as we look here at the data in this most recent report that the Truth Initiative released, something that they noticed here was that in 64% of the top binge watched shows per kid report, so this is from 15 to 24, adolescent and young adult, 64% of the shows that they themselves said that they binge watched one episode after another had tobacco imagery in it. 60% right now of those top shows have it, and also a lot of movies and a lot of music videos. And here's this list here on the right with Family Guy right now is topping it. Simpsons, Big Mouth on my block. Again, if you haven't seen these shows, it's worth watching it, kind of like Michelle said, just to have an idea of what young people are watching right now, because these are the top 15 shows. There's a good chance that a young person is in your life, your child, for example, is looking at these things. And we talk about this a little bit later on as well, but as hard as we might try to put up barriers between young people and content that we really don't want them to see, it is so easy for them to get around it these days. If not from their own devices, then from somebody else's at school. There's a lot of ways to circumvent it. And so it's very much not a safe assumption to think that your child is not watching it if you haven't asked them explicitly. And they've said no when you trust them. But if you're just thinking, oh, they wouldn't watch it, or we don't subscribe to those services, or I have parental controls enabled, that's far from a guarantee that they're not viewing these things. And so it really is important that we are proactive as parents in making sure that we talk with our kids, and get more on that in a minute, but that we've seen the content, that we've prepared our kids to be in this environment, in this social ecosystem, so that when they come across it, as they almost invariably will, they're ready. Now, one thing that I thought was very interesting was this music video aspect, and that was not something that the Truth Initiative had analyzed in their previous reports, but that whole 6 billion views really caught my eye. And if you read the detail of the report, which is worth it, by the way, it's very much worth looking at. You'll read the paragraph they have on that. I had not watched any of the top music videos as well. And so I just pulled one up. Actually, they said that the one which had the most tobacco imagery in their coding was Bandit by Juice WRLD. And so I pulled it up, and yes, lo and behold, like this is 23 seconds in, and the cigarette is basically there. Cigarettes are there the whole time. Here he is holding an alligator. But what really caught my eye about this, again, thinking about how this content echoes and resonates, is the 344 million views it's had, almost 345 million, since it was released in 2019. So much exposure, right? And it'll be interesting to see if academics pick this up and start looking at it as well, in terms of how do music videos specifically influence teens, because they are watching a lot of these. But that is a tremendous amount of viewing over a relatively short amount of time, where they're seeing this over and over and over again. Now, why exposure matters is because there's implications, as I mentioned before, with this media pressure, on what they actually do. So what has been consistent over time, this 27 million number actually was consistent both for this year's Truth Initiative report and the one last year, that because of this episodic repeated programming, 27 million kids are exposed to watching tobacco. And part of what we know is that when kids see someone use tobacco on screen, it triples the likelihood that they start vaping in the next year. And that's interesting, right? Because you think, like, we see someone smoke, we're going to go smoke. But it seems like what's happening actually is they see smoking, but they kind of in their mind convert that to nicotine. And what we see then is they're 3 times more likely to start vaping nicotine. What we do know, however, is that youth who vape are 4 times more likely then to start smoking. And part of why this matters, of course, is that there's tremendous health risks to both smoking and vaping. It's a whole nother presentation. Actually, I think we have this one in the Operation Parent archives, but to talk about what are the health risks of vaping and what does that look like. But so far, actually doesn't look so good. I mean, it's really by no means safe. The only reason why someone should vape is if they were already smoking, because it does seem like there are fewer carcinogens and toxins that you take into your body if you exclusively switch to vaping from smoking. But if you're not already vaping, you shouldn't start. I don't have the slide in this presentation, but there was just a chemical toxicology report that came out about, I think, 3 months ago now, that looked at the chemical composition of vape aerosol, what's actually in there. And they found that when you inhale from a vape, you are actually taking in 1,000 to 2,000 different chemicals, most of which are unidentified. They map them out by molecular weight. And we don't know what any of these things do. And they're created because when you superheat a substance, it breaks down into bunches of smaller molecules and parts. So it is not a safe thing to do. So if someone is vaping and watching nicotine on TV, whether or not it's smoking or vaping, and then repeats that behavior, there are very significant health implications. And there was another study that came out last year as well that found the same thing was true for movies. They concluded actually that 37% of new kid smokers, that they started smoking because of what they saw in movies, which came to 6 million new smokers from movies alone. Now, part of why this really matters, and this was something before I started really looking into nicotine addiction, I was not aware of this, that almost 40%, 39% of smokers are never able to quit. And on the left, you can see smokers who made quit attempts in the past year. And you can see that people tend to quit more than when they're young and are more successful. But look at how low these numbers are, right? The most successful group is ages 18 to 24, and that's 1 out of 10. That's very, very low. And almost 40% never are able to stop. What also is very concerning is that if you are smoking at the time of death, there is a 2/3 chance that smoking is what kills you. So what this means is that if there's 6 million new smokers, it means that 1.6 million of them will eventually die from smoking later in life. And these are from statistics that have been compiled, again, over years and years and years and years. That is really not good, right? Just last year alone, from movies alone, basically we've said there's about 1.6 million teenagers right now who are eventually going to die from smoking. We don't know when, but that's what the statistics tell us. And the sad part about this, right, is it's completely avoidable if the reason why they're starting is because of what they're viewing. Yes, maybe some of them would have found their way there anyway, but even one life matters, right? Much less 1.6 million that are going to be affected by this for decades and decades of their life. Maybe their kids as well one day. Now, it's worth mentioning that we don't have these metrics for vaping yet because vaping is too new. Really, vaping only became mainstream about 5 to 7 years ago. And so we don't have this long-term data on what this is going to look like and how easy it is to quit. Anecdotally from my work, I have not heard that people find quitting vaping any easier than quitting smoking. Some people actually say it's harder because you don't have those natural breaks, like when you finish a cigarette. There's a lot more nicotine in a vape, and people will just carry them around indefinitely. So jury is still out on whether or not it's easier to quit smoking than vaping because it's newer, but let's just say not good signs. And certainly if you can avoid a young person going down this road, they will be better off for it. Now, part of what's challenging though about getting many people to take this message seriously, and I know when I say many people, it probably doesn't include those of you here at the presentation today because you're choosing to pay attention to this. But there's a lot of people who choose instead to dismiss it. On the video that the Truth Initiative put out last year, these are some of the responses that were given on YouTube. If you want to look at them, you'll see them as well. But so when the Truth Initiative says what kids see on streaming services, on TV, really matters for their behavior, these are some of the responses. One of the many reasons I have no faith in humanity: grow up. Okay, so I watch Daredevil. You don't see me jumping on buildings. Everybody smoked. It's part of the 80s, historically accurate, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of people, because it doesn't fit their narrative or it's not what they believe, they put it out there. And then people see that too, and it makes it seem like it's a discussion. And this is one of the biggest issues, I think, again, in the modern media ecosystem, is that science can be pretty clear about something, and then someone else will step up and say that they don't agree, and then all of a sudden there's a controversy, even though the person disagreeing might not have nearly the same credentials to support what's being said. And so this is what we're seeing, though, is that even though psychology is real, modeling is real, there's a lot of pushback on it. So what we're seeing then is that this content continues to come out and create opportunities for kids to fall into this trap in many different ways. And I want to highlight a couple right now. The Queen's Gambit, which was in my opinion, actually a really good miniseries from a storytelling perspective, but was rated MA for mature, right? And that's, again, one of the big issues is that the rating is there, but whether or not that actually stops young people or parents put the control in place to not view it is a whole completely different story. But what we saw in The Queen's Gambit was the main character using drug use as a means to an end, both for coping with anxiety, but then also performance enhancement. When she would take a pill, she then kind of got like a superpower of being able to visualize chess on her ceiling at night in the orphanage and play through games. And that was kind of viewed as part of how she succeeded. This actually mirrors how many adolescents might use stimulants or sedatives right now, or misuse them, I should say. So when we talk about Adderall and Ritalin and kids sharing that to get some performance enhancement or using sedatives to calm down their anxiety, this is part of why addictive drugs are addictive, is that they work in the moment. They have negative consequences long term, but in the moment they feel like they're helping, and maybe sometimes they even are. You know, what Beth is taking in that picture on top is an anti-anxiety medication. I think actually it was a barbiturate, kind of like a benzodiazepine is another type that's kind of in the same class, like Ativan or Xanax or Klonopin. And people are prescribed them because they work, but they're also habit forming. And that's part of with addiction in kids in general, where they're not necessarily seeing the long term because just physiologically their brains aren't totally developed yet. And so they're not able to think in that way, but it doesn't mean that they can't fall into the trap of addiction, which, to be honest with you, also is something that their brains are set up for. Again, different presentation to go too deep into it, but from a neurological level and how their brain interacts with substances, it's very easy for them to develop a dependency. So this mirrors how they might already be thinking about it, and also falls into this invincibility and vulnerability complex of, well, you know, she was using it and it might have gotten out of hand, or she didn't manage it properly, but I could do it better. Like, I'm not going to be that stupid. I could see what she did wrong. But that's not really how it works in real life, right? Is that no one goes into using substances thinking, I'm going to develop a major problem with this, which is going to hurt my grades and my relationship with my parents, and, you know, push away healthy friends in my peer group. And no one really thinks that going in, even if that's the truth and what might end up happening. And in this show in particular, also, again, from a professional perspective, there was a lack of realistic consequences. And so if a young person was watching this, they'd see, you know, what we'll call this mild spoiler alert. So, you know, if you want to watch The Queen's Gambit and haven't already, just mild spoilers here, is that she goes on and off of both alcohol and pills with very few consequences, or even sometimes problem with it. She doesn't have withdrawal. She doesn't go to rehab. She changes her behavior very quickly to be healthier again. That's really not how it works of people at any age. And again, as a professional watching this, I was like, oh man, you know, like that's not how this works. And it could definitely give young people the wrong idea about how they could also interact with these substances if they chose to do so. So again, this is an example, very popular show. Your kids might have seen it, might see it in the future. Very unrealistic depiction of substance use, as well as viewing it in many ways actually as a good thing and as a performance enhancer. Now, another one that I want to highlight today, where the second season actually is just came out and is going on right now, is Euphoria. And in Euphoria, substance use is a central plot point, and hence the name. But what the way it depicts it is something that, particularly in the first season, I'll talk for a second about the second season as well, but particularly in the first season, it was very much billed as a normal part of high school life. So this is a show, if you haven't seen it or don't know much about it, it's based on high school characters. However, those high school characters are played by young adults. Nobody is under the age of 18. And it's tremendous amounts of drug use. Again, it's a central plot point, a lot of sexual content as well. However, in this one, compared to Queen's Gambit, there are more realistic consequences. So when we see people using those substances, bad things happen. But the important part about this to recognize is that normalization doesn't need to be positive. It's very possible for a young person to look at this and to see it as like, well, that's just the cost of doing business to be cool in today's high school. Or these are the sorts of people, this is the sort of lifestyle that people look up to. So even if there's bumps in the road or it's rocky, it doesn't necessarily need to be positive. It could just be describing what they think that life should be. And on the sexual side, I mean, it's a very sexually explicit show as well, not just with sexual acts on screen, but things like sexting, soliciting sex, casual sex, lying about your age, fetishized sexual violence, doing sexual cam shows online while underage. All of that is in there. And this was, the first season in particular, was one of the most watched shows for kids. Just to give you another data point here, about 5 minutes into the first episode, the main character says, speaking to the audience, I know your generation relied on flowers and your father's permission, but it's 2019, and unless you're Amish, nudes are the currency of love. And what, again, as a parent of very young children myself, and as a psychologist, I'm hearing this and being like, oh no, right? Because this is the sort of thing where when you are in high school, you don't know that this show is a caricature. You don't know that this is something where they're the people, it's of course rated TVMA, but that these people are trying to make an artistic point, but they're doing it in a way where if you don't have that perspective, it's kind of like, it's kind of like if you guys remember back to Toy Story, Toy Story, Toy Story 2, Toy Story 3. There are so many like deep existential themes about like death and moving on and stuff that you do not understand when you're 8 years old. You know, like you don't get any of that. That's part of the brilliance of Pixar movies, is there's like something for everyone. This is like the opposite of that, where if you are old enough to take in this content and interpret it properly, you see what they're trying to do. But if you are a young person looking at this as this is what life can be, or this is where I want to take my cues for what's normal and what's not, it was very, very, very concerning. Now, I don't have a slide about this here, but before I go to the next one, just a quick note about season 2. Well, and I was actually speaking to the Operation Parent folks about this yesterday as well. Although I would say in many ways the second season is even more explicit than the first in terms of all the things mentioned on the slide, it seems like they are intentionally trying to do it in a more over-the-top sort of way, which was not there in the first season. So even though there's a lot of very disturbing imagery, I actually felt relieved because I felt like it was less like real life than the first season was. And as we'll discuss in a few slides, that's really important because if it feels like it could be real life or closer to real life, it's a lot easier for young people to emulate it. In the second season as well, they also use the title Euphoria. You know, in the beginning of shows, usually they say the title somewhere. In the first 3 episodes of the season, they use the title ironically. Like something terrible is happening to the characters related to their drug use and the sexual exploits and all of that. And like in the middle of this, them basically being in a very negative place or state, something clearly wrong, the word euphoria comes on the screen. And, you know, that's very clearly meant to be a juxtaposition between actually feeling euphoria and what's really going on from the use in the world. So from that perspective, from the relevancy on young kids and teens perspective, I'm appreciating that. I feel like they've done a better job in season 2 of making it clear this isn't something that you should be doing. But the first season did not feel that way at all, and it was very highly viewed. So just a quick note there about season 2. Now, part of why though seeing this on screen is so important, and there's a mound of research we could talk about this, where I've just picked one that I felt did a very good job and has a nice little graph that we can, or figure rather, that we can look at to illustrate it, is that the intention to do a behavior here on the right is actually related to media exposure to that behavior in a few ways. So what you're seeing here in the middle is whether or not media exposure is related to those things. The dark line means that it is. And then if there's a dark line leading from the ones in the middle to the right, that means that it also impacts the intention to do the sexual action. So what this study found, this one from 2017, was that media exposure made people change their own attitude for how likely they felt like, or rather their attitude towards the sexual act. It changed how people felt about injunctive norms. So there's two types of norms when we talk about behavioral change that we talk about, injunctive and descriptive. An injunctive norm means if I do this, will people think that it's wrong? So basically, will there be social pressure to not do this behavior? And you can see that when kids watch videos of people doing this, it actually lowers the injunctive norm. It makes them think that if they were to do this themselves, people wouldn't have a problem with it. It also it affects the descriptive norm. A descriptive norm is just whether or not you think other people are doing it. It's kind of like there's actually a gap right now between how many teens are actually using THC and marijuana products and how many teens, how many people a teenager thinks are doing it. Basically, if you ask someone in high school how many people they think are smoking weed, they're going to say it's almost everybody. And the reality is actually quite a bit less than half. And certainly on a regular basis, it's a lot less than that. I think seniors is somewhere around like 1 in 5 or 1 in 6. Still higher than you want it, but not almost everybody. So what we see is that media exposure to behavior affects all three of those. All three of those also affect intention. That box down there at the bottom, PBC, stands for perceived behavioral control. So whether or not someone feels like they can control their behavior. And we actually, they found there that it did not affect that, which is why that line is gray. So this other study, here's another one, I'm just beginning, I'm gonna show you guys a couple of these today, shows a positive relationship. So that means as someone views more sexual media, these things happen as well in conjunction. So between sexual media and permissive sexual attitudes, that's that injunctive norm, the descriptive norm again, and then also an acceptance of rape myths. So that's things like it's okay to have sex with a woman if they're wearing suggestive clothing, regardless of what they say. It's okay to pressure for sex. It's not rape if someone changes their mind. These are all rape myths because none of them are true. But if you see more sexual media on TV or streaming services, you're more likely to accept those myths. We also know that the more sexual media that young people consume, the lower their age of sexual initiation, having more encounters and having more risky sexual experiences. Here's one from Rand Health that found that across all different age groups that they looked at from 12 to 17, teens who saw the most sex on television were twice as likely to initiate intercourse within the next year. So these were kids who had not yet had sex and then had made the decision to do so. They were twice as likely at every age based on how much TV sex exposure they're seeing. So the last point I want to make on this one before we pivot again is that empathy also really matters. And this is part of why, as a parent, knowing how you want to approach this matters. If a person knows how to interpret what they're seeing and also has empathy in terms of being able to feel for others, what we find is that that empathy actually lowers that effect, what we call mediates the effect of seeing sexual content on TV. So here you can see in the graph, the high empathy kids, it didn't matter how much sex content they saw, nearly as much as for low empathy. You can see that if they have low empathy, the likelihood of sex behavior is on that y-axis going up and down, and exposure to sex content is on the x. You can see that it goes up, even for high empathy kids. They're more likely to engage in sexual behavior, but there's not that huge effect. The same thing is true for sexual violence in media. So low empathy kids are more likely to do it, high empathy kids are not. Again, worth noting, you can clearly see though that even with high empathy, the more exposure a young person has to sexual violent content, the more likely they are to be sexually violent. And so again, that's where when you look at something like Euphoria, where there's absolutely sexual violence, this is the sort of thing where the less of this media that they consume, the less likely they are to emulate that behavior in real life. So the quantity matters, and unfortunately right now in COVID, the quantity has never been higher. Nielsen, I wish they released an updated graph. They haven't, I've got numbers for you. But this graph they published about in March, or Q2 rather, of 2020. So after the lockdown started. So these are the average weekly streaming minutes in billions. So in Q2 2019, pardon me, people in the United States consumed 81 billion minutes per week. And you can see I stratified by age there. And those first two there on the left, the black one is your 2 to 11, and then your blue one is your 12 to 17. And so you can see those bars go up. But in March 2020, there was a 66% increase in teen viewers, and the average weekly streaming minutes went up to 142 billion. In a very recent report, actually, they just released this a couple weeks ago. They said that over the Christmas, New Year's, holiday-ish sort of that week here in 2021, there were 183 billion minutes streamed per week. That's actually higher than the highest point during the lockdowns, which peaked at 166 billion. So people have, and again, compare that to 81. So people have started streaming a lot more than they used to as we've been more isolated and distanced during this COVID period. And so the implications there for kids is that it's not just that they're seeing the content, but they're seeing it a lot more. Now, one thing you could say is, well, it's on the, the onus can be on the publisher, the person creating this content, to change it. And it would be great if we could trust them to do that. And so after the Truth Initiative study came out in 2019, where they looked at Stranger Things and said, man, you really need to change this, they said, all right, we will. And they did do a couple of things. Actually, smoking is now listed in the parental advisory in the front. Programs with smoking, I believe, now have higher ratings by default. And actually, the most recent season of Stranger Things, season 4, had almost no smoking after that 750 depictions smoking debacle, if you will, from the year before, which prompted the outrage. However, then you've got new shows, right, like Cobra Kai, where in the beginning of both seasons, you've got smoking depiction in both, where Netflix is still actually one of the greatest offenders in terms of the most smoking content that kids are seeing in front of them while they're streaming, from Big Mouth, which is animated on there, that's right at the top of the list, to Queen's Gambit, had a bunch of smoking in it as well. So we can't necessarily trust that they're going to make the change. So the implication of this is that the content will keep coming. And at the end of the day, like we could make an argument about, particularly I'd say for those like G and PG products, that it's like, if this is meant for kids, maybe don't do it. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's one of those really tough intersections between like artistic liberties, trying to communicate a message, saying, well, look, it says TVMA, kids aren't supposed to watch this. It's on the parents. I mean, that's going to be a hard argument to win, I think, or to trust that they are going to change this. And kids aren't stupid, but they are impressionable, right? They're looking for role models and finding identity. And this isn't always something that's conscious. I was, fascinated by the similarities between Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan, when he actually did model his game in many ways after Jordan. And young people do the same thing. They are looking consciously or unconsciously for that culture, that lifestyle, those people who make them feel like they are at home, make them feel comfortable. And what it does is it primes you to think about certain, the technical term we have for it in psychology is that we're cognitive misers. We don't like to think. We like to have what are called heuristics, or like situational scripts, as I put on the slide, for how we think about things. And so if we're thinking like, well, I want to be cool, what does it mean to be cool? I should be vaping. Or I want to be cool. I'm watching season 1 of Euphoria. These people seem really edgy and rebellious, and a lot of things that I want to do. And look, they're doing cocaine. Maybe I should do cocaine. That's the sort of thing where they are impressionable. They're learning all the time about who they want to be and what they want to fit into. And so the messages that they're receiving are very important. And I was referring to this principle on the Euphoria slide as well. The difference, the delta between their reality and the story is critical, because we live within our own context. If you look at something that clearly is fantasy, you're not necessarily going to think that it's real unless you have issues with knowing what's real and what's not, if you have like a psychotic disorder. But if something's pretty close to reality, or close enough that it feels plausible, that's where, when it's relatable, that's when you're starting to have problems. And that's part of when people were doing these studies on 13 Reasons Why, one of them found that 75% of teen and young adult viewers found 13 Reasons Why very relatable. So when you see a character contemplating and committing suicide on there, it's very easy to relate to the show and what people are feeling and what people are doing. That's when you're kind of entering this danger zone. So the kids who are most at risk here, part of it is this repetition, and it's not just in media. I know that this particular presentation is focused on media, but they're seeing it in things. There are some studies here looking at older ones. This was this one that I found from a few years back in terms of music videos. Then they're seeing like Zac Efron do it in a movie. They're seeing it on Snapchat. They're seeing it on TikTok. They're seeing it on billboards in some cases. And so like, how could they not then vape in the bathroom at school? Right? Like it's being communicated to them over and over and over and over that this is what you do if you're cool, if you're rich, if you're part of the in crowd. It's very natural to make that progression. If they're strongly identifying with character struggles and actions, it puts them more at risk. If they don't have that lack of knowledge, if they have rather a lack of knowledge about drugs, alcohol, their consequences, if they don't really know the truth and they're only getting it from these slices they get in the media that might not be accurate, they're more at risk. If they have a permissive friendship group or social ecosystem, so like if everyone around them is doing it as well, or if parents are like, oh, it's just pot, it's not a big deal, they're far more likely to use it than if their social ecosystem, their family ecosystem takes that seriously. We also know from research that if kids have past trauma or active mental health concerns, struggle to tell that difference between fantasy and reality, they're more at risk to starting. So, $1 million question, right? What can we do? So for the next few minutes, we're going to talk about this. I should mention, just for those, it actually struck me, I don't know if we ever actually wrote down how long this webinar was. I think I probably, for those who have to go up the hour, I'm guessing I have maybe like 15 minutes left for slides, and then questions will be after that. So just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page there. So for the next 15, we're going to talk about what you can do. So the first thing is from a strategy standpoint, how can you work with your children around this? So one of the most important things you can do is communicate your attitudes and expectations clearly about substances. Even though it feels like they are disregarding you, we actually know that there is no greater factor that is more important towards a kid's decision than parental attitudes. It really matters. Peer influence is right behind that. That's a really complicated ball of wax, as I'm sure you're aware of if you're a parent, in terms of like, what do you do if your kid falls in with the wrong crowd? But even what you say really matters to them. So make sure you talk about it, ideally talk about it early. Have those conversations at the front end. It's a lot easier to orient your child towards these things in a way that's healthy at the outset and let your expectations be known before they're doing anything than if they're already doing it. It's become part of their identity for who they are, and it's part of their peer group. You know, if they're not oriented towards this, then they might see people in their peer group doing it. They might want to be part of another group if that makes them uncomfortable, right? So making sure that you talk as early as possible directly about this really matters. Limiting exposure also really matters, and I've mentioned that this is really tough, but there's ways to do this, both from a digital standpoint, where you can, this is the screenshot from an iPhone, where the parental controls are, but you can set parental controls on a lot of apps, on a lot of devices, also from social and environmental perspective. If you select pro-social environments for your child to be part of, where it seems like the people the kids there they're going to run into make healthy choices, are doing healthy things, that does an immense service in terms of creating those norms around them where they're less likely to do this behavior. But as I said before, you've got to be proactive because kids will always find ways around firewalls. Do not assume that the barriers you're putting up are going to work. And so either asking your child explicitly about it, again, if you have a solid relationship and you can trust what they tell you, really important. Really important to do that, or even just proactively talk about how they should interpret this content. And then we're going to talk about how you do that in a second, because the worst possible situation for them to be in is for them to be interested in it or to be shown it and not have your input ahead of time, because then they draw their own conclusions, or they're watching it with friends and they're just getting their friends' interpretations, which might not be the healthiest either. Um, Lastly, don't have health or healthy people be on the wrong side of incentives. This is a really loaded bullet point that we could probably talk about for 20 minutes on its own. But in brief, what this is referring to, what I'm referring to here, is that a lot of times kids think that the unhealthy thing, when kids may have to make a choice between doing something unhealthy and doing something healthier that their parents want them to do, they look at it and say, well, I really enjoy what I'm doing with my friends. Like I get fun out of this, or it feels good. Why should I possibly listen to you? And so parents are always just basically punishing. And it doesn't work because for a number of reasons, just punishment alone usually doesn't do it. Not that you shouldn't do that. Boundaries are important. But at the same time, if you don't give kids a reason to work with you other than avoiding discomfort, other than avoiding pain, you're leaving off the most important half of the equation, which is we tend to repeat the behaviors that make us feel good. So if the only thing that's making them feel good is explicit content, or watching these more adult themed shows, or hanging out, or doing drugs, or people with people who do drugs, if that's the place where they're feeling good, then they're going to go back to that. And if the only thing they get from you is negative, they're going to have very few incentives to work with you. So again, very loaded concept, a lot we could talk about there, but at the end of the day, just make sure that the healthy people and behaviors aren't on the wrong side of those incentives. So ways we can help. The first is communicate with love. And this is an acronym I did not come up with, but I absolutely love it, no pun intended, because it's so useful. And that is that love stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. So how you do this though matters. So from the listening perspective, this means active listening. So showing someone that you care with your body posture, with your eye contact, with just not talking and listening. And when you do talk, ask open-ended questions. So these are things where someone actually would have to elaborate rather than just answer with a yes or a no. So things, open-ended questions oftentimes start with words like how, or why, or what. Like, what did you like about that? Or why do you feel a certain way about something? These are questions that make someone go deeper. And then reflections is when someone's talking to you and you reflect back to them their emotions or their content. Like if you're talking to your child and they're talking about how, and they say in kind of like a sad voice about how they got a bad score on a geometry test. If you respond by saying, oh man, that must be so frustrating to have studied so hard and to get a bad grade, that shows you're listening, because you hear their emotion and then you're giving it back to them, right? Even though they didn't say it explicitly, but you're showing that you're listening. Hashtag therapist tricks, by the way. There's a lot more of those we could talk about. But listening, active listening skills, really important for having a good relationship with anybody, but certainly a teenager. Offering is how you offer advice. And this is a trap that I think a lot of parents fall into, where you think that just offering advice straight up is welcomed. I mean, maybe sometimes, but a lot of times it feels pushy. And the thing about pushing is if you push, someone else can push back and you can get into a power struggle. And so I want to suggest you use the feedback sandwich method for offering advice if you're at a point in a conversation where you're ready to offer advice to your teen. What this consists of is the meat of the sandwich is the advice, but the first slice of bread is asking permission. So literally say, hey, I've been through something similar. Do you mind if I share my thoughts? Or do you mind if I give you some advice, or if I share some of what I've gone through with something like this? By asking permission before you share how you feel, that actually makes the other person take ownership of asking for the information. So you're not pushing it on them. They're literally asking for it. This is a research-backed technique which makes people more likely to accept advice. So ask permission first, then share the information that you'd like to share, and then afterwards ask for feedback, ask for reactions. That's the other slice of bread. So ask permission, give the information, and then say, so what do you feel about that? Like, do you think you can even explicitly give permission? Like, it's okay to disagree. Just really love to know how you feel. Do you agree or disagree? That again makes it so that you're clearly not pushing something on someone, and they can take ownership of it. It makes them feel like if they then were to do it, that is their idea. And particularly for teenagers, having agency is really important. Of course, there are times, again, as a parent, where you have to reach down with a firmer hand, you have to guide, or you have to lay down some boundaries to help, make important decisions or keep somebody safe. Absolutely. And if you can, ask for that, if you're in a situation where you can provide a choice, that is immensely helpful. Validating is where you let the child know that what they're feeling is okay. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with them necessarily, but it means that they don't doubt themselves. When you validate someone, it reinforces self-efficacy and self-trust. It's kind of like if you've ever been in an argument with somebody and they've told you to stop being so sensitive or that you're overreacting, that never works, right? Like that's a great way to make any argument worse. And so that works the same way with kids, right? So letting them know, like, I can see why you feel that way, or that's so frustrating, even if it's something that in your mind is trivial or they're overreacting to it, definitely not something to say. Let them know that what they're feeling is okay. You can understand where they're coming from. And this overlaps a lot also with empathy and empathizing. To borrow a phrase from Brene Brown, be in the hole with them. If someone is down in a hole, they don't just necessarily want to be pulled out. First, they want you to get down in there with them. Let them know that they're not alone, that they're going to be okay, that you're with them. And then that might be the time to offer that feedback sandwich and help them get out. So listening, offering, validating, empathizing, really useful tools. As therapists, we use this all the time, and more. This is actually all part of a theory called motivational interviewing. So that's another thing if you'd like to look up, I can give you some resources about that. But this will go a long way towards improving a relationship or sustaining a relationship with your teen if you're not already doing this. One last thing that I want to put out there is all behaviors have a purpose. And so if you see your child doing something that feels counterproductive or counterintuitive, there is a reason. And actually knowing that reason is critical towards changing it. Because if you don't know why someone's doing it, again, like say you've gotten into this dynamic where you're punishing, you're telling them not to do something, but they keep going back, keep going back, keep going back. All that means is whatever benefit they're getting out of going there is more important to them than whatever punishment you're giving. Which doesn't necessarily just mean you should ramp up the punishment. I mean, maybe every case is different, like that's probably part of it. But you also need to figure out what they're getting from that situation that's so valuable to them that they're going to keep doing it. It could be social, it could be emotional, there could be a lot of reasons why. Maybe for some kids, it's even just the fact that you get angry at them means you're paying attention to them. So they're more likely to do it because they just want your attention. Any number of different reasons, but just recognize that all behaviors have a purpose, and knowing that purpose, again, goes a long way towards being able to change something. So in terms of critical thinking around media in particular, so discussions you can have, and you can literally do this with certain content if you feel comfortable watching it with a kid, with your kid rather, with your child, but is ask them questions to really think about the fact that this is not just like a depiction of life. This is a product created by people who have a goal. So like for a show, movie, or something on YouTube, who's behind it? What's their motivation for creating it? What do they want from you? Do they want you to feel a certain way, do a certain thing? How does it make you feel? Do they want you to feel that way? Right? Instead of someone just being pushed around by whatever the creator's wanting, instead, give them an opportunity to understand, like, you're having this experience, you're watching this piece of content that someone has created on purpose to try to do something. What is that? And the same thing is true for ads. Is the advertiser trying to link a product to a lifestyle or identity? How does the ad make you feel about the product? How does the ad send messages about what boys, kids, girls, adults, whatever, should like, wear, eat, drink, or act? The principles that we talked about today are not beyond the comprehension of teenagers. They can get it. And if they To put this a different way, when I do assemblies for kids, I present things very different than for adults. And what I actually lead with is I talk about, I oftentimes speak on vaping and marijuana specifically. I oftentimes start with actually a little section on what is marketing, how does marketing work? And then show them how actually, like what's going on, why vaping is so popular is that there are really rich people who are trying to take advantage of you because you're a kid and they think that they can fool you. And let me tell you, that gets kids very interested. That gets them very interested in what I have to say, far more receptive than when we talk about the health side of vaping, the health side of THC, because the last thing a teenager wants is to feel like they're getting taken advantage of because they're a kid. They want to see themselves as an adult. They want to be treated as an adult. And so this isn't quite as aggressive, obviously, as addictive product marketing necessarily. They're not going for the same thing, but understanding that media, particularly like say TV shows and movies, the people who create this, they're trying to send a message. They're trying to make you feel feelings. That's part of their goal. And pulling back the curtain, hence the Wizard of Oz picture, but pulling back the curtain, letting them see like this is what this experience is really about, helps demystify it and helps make it a lot easier and more tangible. So quick shout out before we get to our summary slide for the Operation Parent Handbook. There are pages 11 through 18 in this are explicitly speak to this and have more ideas, strategies, approaches that you can take in order to work better with your teen. I have a copy of this handbook. I think that there's a lot of tremendous information in there. So absolutely worth grabbing a copy if you're interested in what's inside. I know that I appreciate it. It's back there. I'm not sure where on my bookshelf right now, but it's back there on my bookshelf. So to summarize, put this all together, media exerts influence over culture, which has a direct impact on youth attitudes and behavior. And we can't control the content. And so hopefully over the course of the presentation today, you were able to see how it influences behavior and what that looks like, what puts kids at risk. We can't control the content, but we can shape how they engage with that content and their interpretation of that content. And you can do that by limiting exposure when you can, shape your child's social environment to give them the best chance of being around healthy people and healthy connections. Make sure your attitudes are known. Again, most important thing there is making sure you talk with your kids about it. Again, ideally before they're at the age or actually doing these sorts of things. And then communicate with love to foster the connection, encourage critical thinking so they're not swept around, and help kids understand the complete picture, because that's really what we're talking about here. You can't put them in a bubble and keep them away from all of this, but you can open their eyes and make it so they see everything and interpret it in a way that gives them the best chance to make the healthy choices when you're not sitting there over their shoulder. So thank you guys again so much for taking the time to watch this today. Hopefully it was useful to you. If you'd like to connect, there's my contact. My website's weinerphd.com. Aaron@weinerphd.com is how to email me. And as Michelle mentioned, please feel free to follow me on socials. I am constantly pushing out news articles and journal articles, medical journal articles that I think are relevant in primarily in the lane of addiction psychology, because that is, again, my home. So with that, Michelle and Operation Parent folks, I'm happy to turn it over to you to facilitate the end of the webinar and questions.
Perfect. Yeah, that's right, Dr. Reiner. You push content out into the universe all day, every day. So we appreciate what you're doing for changing lives, particularly here today. Thank you for giving us so much hope as parents, that we have places where we can connect with our teens and make a difference in terms of their choices and what they're doing. We've got a great lineup of questions for you coming down the pike. We're going to tell folks that just a quick couple things about Operation Parent before we get into questions. So this is your chance, audience, if you want to enter another question, or if you have a question that you haven't entered yet, you're welcome to do that now. We'd like to tell you our individual handbook is available for parents online, and this is a great way for you to get into topics that our teens are facing and to ramp up your learning as a parent on each of those topics. It's a fabulous and inexpensive resource, as Dr. Weiner has already mentioned and had a chance to preview at length. So all you have to do is go to operationparent.org in the shop if you're interested in having a copy of our elementary or middle or high versions of our handbook. For those of you that are school representatives or drug-free coalitions or perhaps church organizations, if you have an interest in ordering our handbooks in bulk, as folks often do around the country, we've got a very special offer going today for 15% off 150 handbooks or more. There's also additional discounts available if this is your first time ordering an Operation Parent Handbook. So you can contact us directly at info@operationparent.org if you have any interest or questions about ordering the handbook in bulk. We also, once again, encourage you to join us for our next webinar, March 1st, where the topic is gaming, and Dr. Clifford Sussman will be joining us again. He is an addiction psychologist and has a lot of information for us parents to consider while our teens are involved heavily in their gaming systems. Lastly, here we invite you to join us on our vibrant and very quickly growing Facebook and Instagram social media communities. That's a place where we push information out, and we would love for you to connect with us there if you haven't already. All right, so here we go for the questions.
All right, and I'm actually good for 20 minutes if everyone else is too. So
Okay,
throw them at me.
perfect.
We'll do it.
All right, that sounds really good. We did have one person just acknowledge the good news on the part of your presentation where you acknowledged there's a lower percent of teens smoking marijuana. So that was joyful news to our ears, and we are happy to hear that. Okay, so our first question is, telling someone not to do something will often promote pushback. So how do we get our teens to see it's their choice, whether to vape or not? What conversations can teens and communities have to prompt teens to take ownership of this choice?
Really good question. So I think so. I would break this down actually between from the parent side and then the more community side, because I do think that as parents there's an extra responsibility to if someone's doing something that's hazardous to their health, sometimes you actually do have to step in. But in terms of the less aggressive, like don't push so they can't push back, whenever I speak to high schools, I always start by saying, listen, like I know I'm an addiction psychologist. I know you're at this assembly because you know that adults don't want you to vape. However, what I want you to do is to make your own choices, and I really emphasize that autonomy. That so the thing about addiction, all right, in particular, is that people are literally out there selling it in ways that they are not selling other behavioral health problems. No one is selling depression. No one is selling anxiety. No one is selling childhood trauma. People are literally selling addictive products to teens, and actually teens are the target market, because if you're going to have an addiction, you're 90% of people develop that first addiction while they're a teenager. And so what I like to do and emphasize, and this is coming from a completely genuine place, is let teenagers know that the reason why it's cool is because rich people are trying to get richer at their expense. And there might be benefits to it. They might like it. They might be doing it for a reason. And I think it's important for them to know the implications on their body, on their academic success, and all of these different areas so that they can make those choices for themselves. So that's the positioning that I put myself at, coming in oftentimes as a speaker, as a consultant, because they're not my children, and I don't necessarily have to take more of those aggressive sorts of actions if they're hurting themselves. But if you're in a position to do the same, I've found that that's been a pretty successful approach.
Thank you so much. Our next guest is asking from the frame of working with a 15-year-old. and she's been in there having conversations, and the argument from the teen is, it's just what our generation does. And speaking specifically to vaping and vulgar exposure to content in rap music.
Hmm. Well, so to me, that's a really great example of one of those of descriptive and injunctive norms, right? And part of what what that teen is saying, what the 15-year-old is saying is my peer group, that's what we do. And that is probably true. However, what the statistics tell us, and also, if you spend much time in schools, what that tells you is that outside of maybe some smaller communities, if you don't want to be around a group of kids who's doing drugs, you don't have to be. Actually, in terms of active use, most kids don't do that. It's not that they've never done it or they've never experimented, but the majority of kids, literally the majority of kids, don't use substances regularly. And so if you have a child who does not have that perspective, that's what that means, is that their peer group uses those substances regularly. In terms of the mature content, absolutely, there just is more of that around. I think that it's definitely loosened a bit, but again, one of the heart of my presentation today is not about how do you prevent your child from seeing this stuff, because that can't necessarily work. The heart of the presentation is how do you talk to them about it so that when they see it, they make healthy choices, and how do they see themselves as someone who cares about their body, who cares about their relationships, who cares about those things. And so yes, that is out there in the social ecosystem, but the context really matters. And if someone wanted to find a group of friends, or if you needed to help them find a group of friends that don't necessarily engage in those behaviors, those kids are very much out there. What she's describing, or he is describing, is the current social reality in that peer group.
It's true. I mean, I think there are way more teens not partaking in alcohol or drugs than are, um, but it's not often what gets the PR or what gets the focus or the attention, perhaps. Our next parent is a guardian who is raising two teens that lost their parents, both parents, due to drug overdose. So first and foremost, let us say sorry for that loss,
Yeah.
big time. And she's wanting to just have authentic conversations about how smoking and vaping could impact the teens that she's raising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so it's when addiction runs biologically in a family, that's tough because there's definitely genetic components to it. And if you've lost both your parents to overdoses as well, that's a tremendous amount of childhood trauma. And the thing that we know about addiction is that many children have adverse childhood experiences, is the technical term for it, where they are trying to deal with strong emotions and situations and they don't know how to cope with it. And so even if drugs took the life of their parents, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to go down the same road. In many ways, actually, there's some modeling elements of it where they might, and also some genetic elements that might make it even more likely. And so, yes, having open and honest conversations about it is important. It may also be something, if it's very sensitive, as it probably is, that could be very helpful to do in family therapy with a therapist. Additionally, if they are struggling emotionally, making sure that they're getting the mental health resources they need so that they can cope well without numbing out in some way or needing to use substances is probably going to be incredibly important. But that is just a very challenging situation, and particularly if everything isn't going well, I would very much encourage you, whoever you are, to get some professional help, because that's what people like me are there for. It's a really tough situation.
Thank you for all of that insight, deep insight. We appreciate it so much. We've got lots of folks that are representing younger children, And so one of the questions is framed up like this: the American Academy of Pediatrics encourages parents to start talking by age 9. So let's think for a minute about the age range of 9 to 12. What are some suggestions or tools to address alcohol and vaping and marijuana use in that young age group?
Hmm. Really good question. So the most important thing you can do at that age, and this, by the way, is something also I about a couple months ago, I did a continuing medical education, a CME event for pediatricians on screening for drug use in primary care, pediatrics. And because I'm not a pediatrician, I'm a psychologist, I actually interviewed several pediatricians who were experts in addiction on how they handled it to include in the presentation. And one of the most consistent things I heard, it was all three of them, was start early and have this conversation before they're doing, have conversations before they're doing the behavior about the behavior. And the most important thing you can do for that middle school age range is to, obviously the really hard science isn't the way to go, but is to talk about it in a spherical way, kind of like we have today, about if all you're doing is going out there with the scare tactics of like, this can destroy your life and don't do it, only bad people do it, and you're just going to fall into addiction, their eyes or their experience is not going to back that up. When they finally do see it, they're going to see, wow, it seems like my parent was really talking in hyperbole. Well, probably won't use that word, but that's the idea. They're really exaggerating, right? They were trying to scare me. It's not all that bad. My friends are telling me it's not all that bad. And so instead of going that more scare tactic-y route, actually put out there that some people do this because they think it's helping them. And it might even do something positive in the short term. And it's actually very dangerous, and it's a trap, and it's something that hooks you. And just keep it simple like that to start. Obviously, as the brain gets more sophisticated and can understand more, you can expand on that. But helping them understand that it's something that grows. It's like a disease that gets worse. And it's something that hooks people in because in the beginning it doesn't feel like it's that bad. And letting them know that that's how this process starts is very important. The other part of it, not necessarily focusing directly on the substances, is to try to engender a feeling in the child that making healthy choices is part of who they are. Like, I am a person who takes care of my body. I'm a person who takes care of myself. I want to be a healthy person, whether or not that has to do with food choices that you're making, or going to bed on time, having limits, trying to get them to identify as a person who chooses health because you want to have a healthy body and a healthy life, without even necessarily going down talking about substances specifically. Because if they see themselves as someone who wants to be healthy and have a best brain they can have, and if that's how they see themselves, then the idea of vaping high potency pot concentrates isn't going to jive with that personal identity, and it's going to be less likely that they make that jump.
Awesome. Hey, if you don't mind, I'm going to take one of the questions from a parent perspective,
Ooh,
and then
yeah.
you chime in here at the end. But a parent asked us, do we think that telling kids that they can't watch these things will actually work? And I'll just say, from my personal learning perspective and putting together this webinar, that our baseline intention was just to leave parents and professionals with a bit of homework to go out and watch shows and just sort of know exactly what is happening out there. Our team did that as this exercise in working with you, Dr. Weiner. And it's whatever you have time to do as a parent. If it's checking out Common Sense Media and looking at the rating of shows, or and we'll encourage you to read through that and look at all the comments there, like not just a few, and or watch a show all the way through. Because what I found is the preview for a show is concerning, but then when I got in there and watched an episode of one of the series, or two of the series, three of the series actually, um, there's a lot of content there and a lot of ways that you can go with the conversations with your teens, just to sort of gauge where they're at and let them know you understand what they're watching. And just that alone as a parent is a really powerful exercise. Just get in there and know what they're watching and watch exactly what they're watching so you have an idea of the breadth of the content and what is it exactly that they're being exposed to.
Yeah. And I think, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily also a one size fits all for how you, like what you say to your children and, how mature they are, the sorts of friends I mean, there's a whole constellation of things to take into consideration about when you think a child could be more safely exposed to something that's got drug use in it or that's sexually explicit. What I would say though is that, some of like take Euphoria for example. Again, all of it, but again, particularly season one. Um, I think that there is definitely harm that could come to a child based on the research that I've seen from internalizing those messages and hearing those messages. And so as a parent, I don't think I would certainly not certainly not under the age I'd say of like 16, maybe not 17, 18. I mean, at a certain point, they're going to do what they're going to do. But I don't know if I would actively supply that just because of the data we have on the likelihood that they're going to go out and do impulsive sexual acts or sexual violence. They're going to take some of those messages. Again, if you actually watch the show, I think you'll understand that the messages in there, if they were to actually internalize them or think that that's true, could be very destructive. And so I'm reminded there was a parent that I was working with at one point who was asking like, well, like my son really wants to smoke weed. And so, what if I say like once a month you can go do this with your friends and just like give a little bit, they felt like it wasn't such a big deal. And I said, listen, we have evidence that shows that even small amounts of cannabis use impacts brain development, cognitive sides. I mean, there's so many things. It is literally poisoning your child. And so if you want to say yes, one, because you're asking, because you've done all the right things, you can poison yourself for a day, a month. I mean, okay, I guess if that's the sort of parent that you're going to be, all right. But like for me, I would not do that. And so it's, saying you can't do it is different also than supplying it or saying that you can. But at the very least, I think it's important to let them know that, and this is what we've been talking about today, that the themes they're going to encounter if they do choose to find it somewhere are not necessarily accurate. And that there's a lot of stuff that's very intense and potentially disturbing and that doesn't look like real life. And so, yeah, the conversation, being proactive is really the most important part. Beyond that, it's just about how you want to be as a parent and gauging the maturity and the relationship you have with your child in terms of where you put boundaries and how you message certain things.
And that, Dr. Weiner, is a powerful way to leave us with that strong thought and to begin to close out the webinar. We thank you for the hope that you've given us. We thank you for the ideas of how to get in there with our teen and discuss things and just be the best parent that we can be. I just want to remind everyone who's still with us, and there are a lot of people still with us, that Operation Parent, I know you are as well. We're here to help in this journey and provide resources, and we will continue to do that. We hope that everyone here will join us for our next webinar, potentially check out our handbook, watch you as you crusade on the important topics that are hitting our families and surrounding our families. We also wrapped this presentation with those resources so parents could read up on smoking and vaping and just be more familiar with the number of images that our teens are exposed to and the renormalizing, of smoking and vaping the way it is presented right now in streaming. And you've given us so many things to layer on top of that and think about. So we thank you again. We will see you soon. And everybody that's with us today, we'll see you at our next webinar, if not before then.
Thanks
So
again, everybody.
Thanks so
Appreciate
much.